Hello, English speakers everywhere. I am very happy to welcome in this space Paul Gregory, remarkable author and an expert in Russian Soviet economics and also in Soviet history. And Mr. Gregory is mm, I don't know your position with the Hoover Institution, but is you part of this remarkable establishment? And welcome, welcome, welcome. The Russian American, everybody's welcome actually in this video stream. How are you doing?
My exact title at Hoover is Research Fellow, and I'm quite grateful that I've been active with the Hoover Institution for about 15 years. So I'm very proud of this appointment.
And what the research you do, and the very interesting books that came, both scientific in terms of studying the Russian economics, of which most of the viewers were part, our viewers here, and know what the situation was, and wondering how it lasted for so long. But your most recent book was about the Oswalds, and you have pretty unique experience. And seeing that it's 60 years anniversary of this mournful date of assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the President of the United States, in 1963, obviously. I would like us to start with the account of how this book came to be and what is it in it. And everything is on Amazon. I will provide the link to the whole body of work as presented at Amazon.com of the Paul Gregory's books, and they all a fascinating read.
Well, you might want to know how this came about. By my count, there are, I think, including myself, 3 persons left alive, not counting Marina Oswald, who knew the Oswalds fairly well, and I would be among those 3. And it all came about because of my father's Russian heritage. He was born in Chita, Siberia, emigrated to the U.S. and graduated from Berkeley and became a petroleum engineer. His hobby was teaching Russian at the local library in Fort Worth, Texas, which happened to be Lee's hometown. And so when Lee returned from Minsk to Texas, he sought out my father to get a certificate stating that his Russian was good enough for him to be employed in some way with Russian language. That visit to my father's office led to my taking regular lessons in Russian from Marina, although there was very little lessons going on. It was more shopping, talking, seeing the sights, etc. So I spent a good part of the summer of 1962 with Lee and Marina. The whole time we spoke Russian, and my Russian improved during that time. So I scarcely heard Lee speak English. It was mainly Russian. But that's how things got started. You might have some questions about that.
How old were you at the time?
Marina and I were both 21. I guess Lee was 23, 24. So in looking back, I was just a kid. They were just kids. And one of the notable features that came out of this time spent together was the fact that Lee very much wanted to keep Marina in isolation because they were living poorly. She really didn't know how poorly they were living because she was comparing their living style with that of Minsk, and they had a small duplex in a bad part of town. For her, that was not too bad. So it was somewhat of a concession to him that they agreed that I would come to their house on a regular basis and we would take Russian lessons as the formal purpose of those visits were or was.
What's your impression of Lee Harvey Oswald in person? Because we hear all kinds of characteristics about him, and from being basically a psychopath to being a very calculated and highly desirable asset for any intelligence service.
I can't speak to intelligence service, but I do write based upon my impressions of him at the time and then 60 years later, because I think I'm a little wiser 60 years after the fact. I think one of the big problems associated with the assassination is the fact that we grossly underestimate Lee Harvey Oswald. He was not to be underestimated. He was devious. He was a careful planner. He was a manipulator. He we misjudged him largely because he was dyslexic, which is not that well known. He could not write. He could not spell. He could not punctuate. Nevertheless, he read voluminously, and he read Marxist books and material. And as far as I could see, he was indeed a Marxist. It wasn't a pose of his. I thought it was a pose, but in reading through the Warren Report and looking at some of his writings, I became convinced that he was indeed a committed communist, although he didn't really understand it very well, but he was committed to it.
Yeah, it's a common thing, unfortunately, in the West when people become committed to something that they don't make even an effort to understand completely, like we've seen with communism, and we see now with Hamas, and people just stop reading after they see the bombing of hospital. They turn off the TV and go to protest without waiting for a clarification. But it's what do you make of the general arc of his life? Like, there's to each life there is an arc, and you see how the person got to a place where he kind of completed his highest achievement. What do you think of his
Well,
life?
it's a good question because I've thought about this a lot in retrospect. Um, I would characterize Lee as someone who always believed that the grass was greener on the other side of the fence. So he was in constant motion. He studied Marx as a 15-year-old, following his mother, who kept changing jobs and locations. He joined the Marines because he could see that he would not be graduating from high school. So the Marines was the green grass on the other side of the fence. He failed in the Marines. He went to the Soviet Union, which was supposed to be this worker paradise. He then learned, well, it's not a worker paradise. The grass might be greener if I go back to Texas, where I can use my Russian language skills. Publishers will want to publish my historic diary. So his return to Texas was again trying to get the green grass on the other side of the field. At about the time of the assassination, he had his eyes set on a new green grass, which was Cuba. So much of what he was doing in the last few months before the assassination was preparing the way for him and Marina and children to go to Cuba. So his visit to Mexico City, which many believe is where he got his assassination orders from either the Cubans or the Russians. As far as I'm concerned, the real purpose of that visit to Mexico City was to get visas to go and live in Cuba. So the general answer to your question is there was no real arc because in terms of things getting better, he would become optimistic about the life he would lead, let's say, in Cuba, or the life he would lead in Texas, disappointment, and then going somewhere else. So that's the way I describe the arc of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah, so he would be a pretty bitter character altogether after all those failures, I would imagine. Or he wouldn't treat it like as failures.
Well, I tell you, he was very, very upset that he could not get a job that paid more than the minimum wage. In fact, that was one of his frustrations. As far as he was concerned, he was a special person. He had a mission in life. His mother brought him up to believe in that. He was not recognized properly. People didn't like him. They liked his wife, but they didn't like him. This bitterness was really expressed in the form of there was someone asked him, well, aren't you grateful to these people who got you this job, one of his jobs in Dallas? And his answer was, who should be grateful to someone who got me a job that pays $1.25? So the fact that he was throughout his life treated as a manual worker, even in Minsk, where he was a celebrity, was a very bitter pill for him to swallow.
Mm-hmm. How was his Russian, by the way? Was it any of any industrial quality, so to speak?
It was industrial quality. I doubt if he took lessons, they were self-taught. In fact, he did use textbooks to try to learn Russian. I'm a pretty good judge of his Russian because of the time we spent together and speaking Russian almost exclusively. It was quite serviceable. He could express any idea he wanted to express in Russian. His grammar was not good at all, and Russian grammar is very difficult anyway. So this is not the language that he would have learned had he been sent to some special KGB operation. So serviceable, ungrammatical, but a great ability to express himself, which I believe is characteristic of people who are living in a country and are exposed to the language on a daily basis. This is the way he spoke.
Some say that his meeting Marina was a setup by KGB, and I was wondering what was the social. I don't know how to describe it, but educational level, demeanor, Marina's. How would you place her in terms of personal traits? Was she a working class girl, or something above that, or she was a ladylike person as far as it was possible in the Soviet Union? What can you tell about her?
Well, let me say something about Lee, and that is that in Minsk, Lee was a celebrity. He was probably the only American in town. And as such, he was in high demand. The girls would go out on dates with him. He had his own apartment, which you would know is a quite significant factor.
Oh, yeah.
He had plenty of money. In fact, his salary at the Minsk radio factory was equal to that of the general director of the factory. So he led a very good life in Minsk, and his biggest mistake in life was leaving Minsk, because he had a very comfortable life in Minsk, including the fact that he did attract girlfriends. Marina was not the first Russian girl to whom he proposed. I think the first one was Ella German, but he met Marina at a dance.
Mm-hmm.
Put on by the Komsomol or what have you.
Yeah.
So he met her there.
No unlicensed dancing.
But anyway, he met her at a party in which she was dressed in a very attractive red dress, and he was immediately attracted to her, and she seemed to reciprocate. So he did propose to Ella German. She turned him down for reasons he didn't probably understand, but what she told him when she turned his proposal down was, "You don't know what it would be like for me to live in Minsk and be married to an American. Remember, the Stalin purges were not that far in the past." But Lee was, I think, unaware of things such as that. As to Marina, I think some of the suspicion was that her uncle was a Interior Ministry official.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we all know that the Ministry of Interior officials can be anything from a registrar in some city hall to an operational agent. So I don't associate a lot of weight with her having a uncle who was in the Interior Ministry. I'd like to know exactly what department he was in. As far, whether I would have thought Marina was a plant of some kind, I would have regarded that as rather ridiculous at the time. But it's not something I spent a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah. Was she tight with her family that remained in Belarus?
Well, I think the biggest, the closest family relationship was uncle and aunt. The uncle being the Interior Ministry guy, and that may explain why she was able to get an exit visa from the Soviet Union. They did receive a lot of letters from friends, one being from Pavel, whose last name I forget, who was clearly KGB plant, told to befriend Lee. They got letters, and in one letter there was even reference to me, that she was teaching me Russian and things must be going well because of that. I would say, he had at least two. She received a lot of correspondence from friends. He received correspondence from Pavel, the KGB plant, and Ernst, whose last name I forget. So he had two good friends, which is more than he usually had. It was usually zero. I think because there were no language problems for Marina in Minsk, she was a very popular person who fit into circles of friends and so forth. But I would have regarded it rather crazy if someone had asked me at the time, "Do you think she could be an agent of some kind?"
So I wonder what brought them together, because she was clearly a socially inclined person, and he was dyslexic misanthrope, from what I can see.
I think Marina, although she would deny it, I think she did have in mind that if she married him, she would get to go to the United States. She was somewhat of a rebel, which a side of her I didn't see in Texas. She was somewhat of a rebel because she had to endure humiliation from the local party cell after she had declared her intent to go to America with Lee. So, although she probably would have denied it, the prospect of going to the United States might have been part of her motivation.
It's amazing, and one of the things that kind of I lived for 36 years in Soviet Union, and I left when I was 36 for the United States, And one of the things that amazed me when I read the biography of Lee Harvey Oswald was that he got employed by this facility in Minsk, which was the television factory or radio factory at the
Yes.
time.
Mhm.
And I used to think of all those factories in Soviet Union like they never called it a tank factory or a howitzer factory properly. It was always something like a railroad equipment plant or the what else? The tractor production facility, like the one in Chita or Chelyabinsk, probably right now, or Sverdlovsk. So, how come an American was employed in such a highly, you can say, she's also half secretive uh, mm, arrangement?
Well, as you know, the Minsk radio factory was the largest employer, so
Hmm.
that was one factor. But as you know, in Soviet style factories, they'd have the regular department and
Yeah.
then the special department. And I guess they figured as long as we can keep this guy out of the special department, he's not a danger to us. So I don't think they were that worried about that.
I think they watched him too. I mean,
Oh
judging
yeah.
just from the conversation to see if he would be interested, if he would be inclined, because they may have hoped to, they might have hoped to convert him into becoming an agent, or see if he is an agent prior to coming to the Soviet Union. So it's kind of provocative environment for him to exist in Minsk.
Well, remember when he returned his U.S. passport at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, he said, I consider myself now a citizen of the Soviet Union. I will work on behalf of the Soviet Union." And this was a threat that he was making because there are stories that he might have known something about the U-2 flights out of Japan, and
Mhm.
he was openly offering whatever knowledge he had accumulated, which wouldn't have been very much, to the Soviets, and they did not seem to be interested, as far as I can see.
So interesting. So, jumping to the end of his life, to the actual event of the assassination, what's your position and what's your expectation? Why the government is not publishing the entire body of documentation? And do those talks about CIA being involved and the second shooter and the third shooter and any number of shooters, do they have any grounds?
I From the minute I saw Lee on television
Hmm.
around 3 or 4 p.m.
Yeah.
um, November 23rd, 63, I didn't really have a problem with the notion that Lee did it and he did it alone. Uh,
I just realized this very moment when you see someone with whom you were so close, sorry to say, assassinating the U.S. president.
yeah. No, and in the book I do, state my reasons, hopefully in a systematic fashion. But already the next morning, when I was picked up by the Secret Service as one of the few known associates of Lee, from that moment on, I really didn't doubt that he did it and he did it alone. I could not see him organizing a conspiracy or being willing to become part of a conspiracy. Uh, he did have the means, he did have the intellect, he did have the planning ability, and what people who think he was, let's say, a patsy, I think most accept the fact that he fired the rifle. But then the question is, was he a patsy? I can't see him being in that position. So from that morning, the next morning to the present day, I never had any problem with the notion that he did it and he did it alone. What's often forgotten by those who believe in what would have had to be a very complicated conspiracy, they tend to forget the fact that he'd already exhibited the fact that he was inclined towards a political assassination, because he did come very close to assassinating General Edwin Walker, who was in his house, and Lee just barely missed him. And had Lee gotten Walker, that would have been, the police would have eventually figured it out, and that would have been the end of his assassination career. I sympathize with those who believe in conspiracy, because we have trouble with what could be called the little man in history issue. That is, do things happen by chance, or is there some one or some things that sort of dictates major events? And the killing of President Kennedy changed U.S. history. And so are we willing to believe the fact that some little guy, dyslexic, earning $1.25 an hour, could kill a president by himself? That strains credulity, but I have no problem with that.
Oh, absolutely. And the celebrity culture was already germinating and in full display. And you can see a lot of achievements by single person, a regular person, seemingly reaching the world's highest level. And a lot of people don't believe that Shakespeare could have written the plays that he wrote, and the Beatles, just boys from Liverpool, not to put all those three together. But basically, the one person is a pretty big power, a pretty serious unit of action. And did you see him practice sharpshooting or talking about weapons excessively?
No.
Not at all, right?
No. I'd say the most interesting observation I had to volunteer was that Marina was quite fascinated by the Kennedy family, as were many or most Americans. A very attractive family. We didn't know about his scandals at the time. You know, she admired Jackie. She admired Jackie's being a good mother and he being a good father. And I believe their marriage was indeed a marriage of love, because she had all kinds of opportunities to escape him. In fact, you might be interested in knowing that it was we, the Gregorys, who introduced Lee and Marina to the Dallas Russians. And that led to, so then you could go back and say, well, if it had not been for that dinner, history would have changed. But the chances of you and I sitting here exchanging ideas via laptops, probability of that is about 1 in 100 trillion. So you cannot write off chance, probabilities, etc.
Interesting. All those things are extremely, thought-provoking in many ways. And what do you think of Jack Ruby's part?
I did not know Jack Ruby. There are, again, the sequence of events that led to Ruby shooting Lee Harvey Oswald in the stomach. That's an incredible chain of events, just like it's an incredible chain of events that Lee Harvey Oswald happened to be on the 6th floor of the book repository building as JFK passed. You know, I was there 2 weeks ago, my first visit to the 6th floor museum. And so I did look at the picture Lee would have had as the president passed by. The most intriguing fact is that in subsequent conversations, I learned, and I don't know if this is true, that Oswald did pass up the optimal time to shoot, that he waited around 5-10 seconds. And that tells me at that point in time, here's this little guy, the president is in his sight, and am I really going to do this or not? And so I've asked the 6 Corps people to look into this. Was there indeed a pause where he passed up the best shot? I did talk to some of some notable Marines who were at Hoover Institution, and they said for anyone with minimal Marine training, those shots were very easy. I'm not a weapons person myself, but there seemed to be a consensus. It wasn't a difficult shot.
Yeah, it's the uniqueness of what you're saying is that you actually walk the walk, unlike so many people who judge and write about this based on other people's writings. And it's really something to think about. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking that could be some familial source of his doing what he has done, and being sort of jealous of Marina's admiration for the presidents, the whole family of Jackie and Jack.
Well, it also would have been an obstacle to the assassination, in the sense that if this was indeed a marriage of love, Lee would have known the consequences for Marina of his killing the president. So, whether I don't think he was jealous of Jack Kennedy. In fact, the reason I even had this conversation with both of them was the fact that on their coffee table was one publication, and that was Time Magazine, with Lee, with JFK Man of the Year. And so we talked about that particular issue, and that's where Marina expressed her admiration, and Lee seemed to sort of go along with it. So I don't think he had anything against JFK, but killing JFK could put him in the history books, and it could do other things for him as well.
It also stands in the way you describe it, and it stands in the way of the Soviet Union's involvement into this process, because Jack Kennedy was to Khrushchev was a very kind of easy mark, so to speak. That's how they treated him, and they didn't take him very seriously. So it was rather convenient for the Soviet Union to keep him alive and not to plan any assassinations of his through their agent, allegedly, supposedly, possibly Lee Harvey Oswald, as some think. So he was a good president for the USSR, don't you think?
Well, we're talking about Lee.
Yeah.
They regarded him, I think it was, who was it? I think Yeltsin, turned over the file, the Lee's KGB file,
right,
to the U.S. authorities. And when he first arrived as this 18-year-old kid who wanted asylum and citizenship, you can. And I'm a pretty good judge of these documents as to whether they're real or not. I believe they are real. They regarded him as a huge pest, and the fact that he had attempted suicide to remain in the Soviet Union convinced them that this guy was trouble. They didn't want an ex-Marine dying from self-inflicted wounds in Russia. So, the first part of the Lee Harvey Oswald file dealt with him as this young kid. And, I was surprised that the Oswald 19-year-old asylum seeker, that it was dealt with by the Politburo itself. So this was a pretty big deal for them. And their big worry was the guy was mentally ill. And I think they knew what life was like in the Soviet Union and in America, so they couldn't quite figure out why anyone who was not mentally ill would want to stay in Soviet Union. The second part of the file has to do with assassination, and that assassination really shook the Politburo, at least to its very roots, because they did not understand the American system well enough to know, well, the president's dead, but the president, all hail the new chief. They didn't understand that there would be a sort of an orderly succession. And what they worried about was that some generals would hold a coup, get hold of the government, and launch a missile strike on the Soviet Union. So they took this very, very seriously and were very worried about what would happen if it turned out that Lee was indeed the one who did it, and that he was an avowed communist who had deserted to the Soviet Union. So they figured this could lead to nuclear war. And so they dealt with it very seriously.
It's interesting that the inauguration of Lyndon Baines Johnson was actually the biggest gathering on the National Mall. I recently looked into the numbers. That the biggest number of people who ever gathered in Washington, D.C. On any event was the inauguration of Lyndon Johnson. And it's demonstrated to me the unity of the nation at the time behind the new president. However, JFK was used to be loved by the public, and he remains a figure that is unattainable for others' status, so to speak, in America.
It was, the LBJ had an impossible task following up an assassinated JFK, and I for the first time hear your statement about the numbers that gathered there. My father translated for Marina in the post-assassination days immediately after, and part of the Soviet strategy was to convince the world that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the killer, because they didn't want someone with his background being identified as the killer. And so that led actually to the fact that the Soviets, through Gus Hall, I believe, who was the head of the American Communist Party, floated this idea that some crazy white Russian was translating for Marina, namely my father, and that he was mistranslating her to cast the blame on Lee. So the Gregory family is part of some of these conspiracy theories.
What was her immediate reaction after the facts?
Well, my father told her that Lee had died. So he was. There were 4 or 5 people in cars with Marina and the mother, who was totally crazy. Her reaction, I would say, was, but she had already had this terrible reaction with respect to the killing of Kennedy.
Yeah.
So for her, this was the second. but she insisted on being taken to Parkland Hospital to view the body.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess in her tradition, you're supposed to kiss the forehead of the deceased. So that was that all of that my father witnessed. So he actually had more interesting stories to tell than I.
Yeah, it's an amazing chapter of American history that's haunting the rest of the century and echoes still today. And it's something that I would say will be the subject of many thoughts. And how would you characterize, maybe my final question to you today, how would you characterize the turn of events after the assassination, the turn of the American history? What was the effect, the main probably 2 or 3 factors that it brought about?
Well, this is called counterfactual history, and I'm not a practitioner of counterfactual history. Of course, the most immediate question would be Vietnam. Would JFK have avoided this morass of Vietnam or not? And I'm sure there remain hundreds of books to be written on this very question, and I could not do a better job than anyone else. But I appreciate your interview. Your questions quite interesting, and hopefully your audience will be interested. And let's stay in touch.
Thank you so very much. Mr. Gregory was our guest. Paul Gregory, research fellow at the Hoover Institution, author of, at least on Amazon, there's 14 books of yours, all on interesting subjects. If anybody wants to go into a deep dive about the miracle of Soviet economy, and stories about more mundane matters like Brain of Vladimir Lenin.
Yeah.
Or the story of the Oswalds, the family of a man, Lee Harvey Oswald, who killed the American president John Fitzgerald Kennedy 60 years ago. Everybody's welcome to read the books and ask questions. We have now direct line with Mr. Gregory. And thank you, Paul. Thank you so very much for your time. It's really precious.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.